They thought the system ran on schedules, machines, and neat rows of data. They were wrong. It ran on her hands, steady, precise, invisible. The moment she stepped back, something deeper than steel began to unravel, quietly at first, then all at once. The factory floor had its own language, metallic, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Conveyor belts hummed like disciplined soldiers. Robotic arms moved with rehearsed precision, and somewhere beneath it all lived a pulse only a few could truly hear. She was one of them. Every morning, before the supervisors arrived with their tablets and polished shoes, she was already there, gloves on, eyes scanning, listening, not just to noise, but to patterns. A slight hesitation in the press, a breath too long between cycles. To most, it was background sound. To her, it was conversation. She didn't announce her fixes. She didn't need to. A minor recalibration here, a tightened bolt there, a subtle override no one logged but everyone benefited from. Production stayed smooth, quotas were met, reports looked flawless, invisible work perfectly executed, and invisibility, as it turns out, is a dangerous kind of excellence. The day the VP visited, the atmosphere shifted. Floors were scrubbed twice. Managers hovered like anxious satellites. Even the machines seemed to perform a little louder, as if aware they were being judged. She stayed where she always was, by line 3, half shadowed, hands steady, focused. That's when the announcement came. They gathered near the central console, a small stage of sorts, improvised from pallets and authority. The VP stood there, voice crisp, rehearsed, carrying that particular tone reserved for decisions already made. "We're proud to promote fresh talent," he said, gesturing toward a young trainee. Clean uniform, nervous smile, barely 6 weeks on site. Innovation requires new perspectives. Applause followed, obligatory hollow. She didn't clap, not out of defiance, out of calculation. Her eyes shifted, not to the trainee, but to the control panel behind him. A flicker, brief, almost imperceptible. But it was there, a signal, a whisper. Then came the sentence, casual, careless, surgical. "You're just a mechanic," the VP added, glancing in her direction without really seeing her. "We need thinkers at the next level." Something in the air changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just shifted. She finished tightening the last bolt in her hand. Slow, precise, as if completing a ritual. Then she stood up, removed her gloves with deliberate calm, and placed them on the edge of the console. No argument, no protest. Silence, but not the empty kind. She walked off the factory floor. At first, no one noticed. Why would they? The machines were still running. The screen still displayed green indicators. The trainee was shaking hands, the VP already moving on to the next talking point. Everything looked intact, but systems don't fail all at once. They hesitate. They stutter. They test the absence before collapsing into it. An hour later, lane 3 slowed by 3%. A minor fluctuation, logged but ignored. By midday, a recalibration loop began repeating on line 5. The trainee adjusted parameters, textbook correct, practically useless. By evening, the rhythm was off, subtly but undeniably. The kind of off that doesn't show in summaries, but echoes in the bones of the system. And still, oh, no one called her. Because to call her would mean acknowledging something uncomfortable, that the system they believed was automated had always depended on a pair of hands they never truly valued. The night shift reported a delay, minor, temporary, manageable, on paper. But somewhere deep in the machinery, something essential had already stepped away, and it wasn't coming back on command. And the factory hadn't even begun to understand what it had just lost. By the next morning, the factory floor sounded wrong, not silent, worse, uneven. The usual rhythm had fractured into something hesitant, like a band playing without its conductor. Conveyor belts jerked instead of flowed. Robotic arms paused a fraction too long before completing their cycles. The harmony was gone, replaced by a mechanical uncertainty no one could quite name. But everyone could feel. Supervisors started arriving earlier than usual, tablets in hand, brows already furrowed. Overnight reports showed small deviations. Nothing catastrophic, but persistent. A 5% drop here, a 7% delay there. Individually insignificant. Together, unsettling. The trainee stood at the central console, trying to look composed. He scrolled through diagnostics, tapping commands with increasing urgency. Everything appeared normal. No critical failures, no red alerts, just inefficiency spreading like a hairline crack through glass. "Have you checked calibration sequences?" one manager asked. "Yes," the trainee replied quickly. "Everything aligns with standard parameters." Standard. That word lingered in the air like a quiet accusation. Because what had kept this place running wasn't standard, it was instinct. Adjustments too small to document, corrections too subtle to quantify. The kind of knowledge that doesn't sit in manuals. It lives in experience. And experience had walked out yesterday, leaving behind nothing but perfectly structured ignorance. By midday, the cracks widened. Line 2 stalled for 12 minutes, long enough to trigger concern, not long enough to justify panic. The trainee reset the system. It resumed. Problem solved, except it wasn't, because 15 minutes later, Line 4 repeated the same pattern. Then Line 1, a pattern within patterns, something misaligned at a level deeper than code. But to see it, you had to know where to look. And more importantly, you had to know what not to ignore. "She used to handle these fluctuations," someone muttered near the back. Quiet, almost reluctant. No one responded, not because they disagreed. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting the obvious, that the person they dismissed as just a mechanic had been the quiet architecture behind their stability. And that architecture was now missing. By late afternoon, the numbers stopped pretending. Production dropped 18%. Meetings were called, voices lowered, then raised. Charts were pulled up, analyzed, debated. The data didn't lie, but it didn't explain either. Everything pointed to minor inconsistencies, none severe enough to justify the scale of disruption. It was like watching a perfectly built structure slowly forget how to stand. The trainee, now pale, attempted deeper overrides. He followed protocol, escalated diagnostics, even contacted technical support. External specialists reviewed logs remotely, offering textbook solutions that dissolved the moment they touched reality. Because the issue wasn't in the system, it was in the absence of someone who understood it beyond its design. Evening approached, heavy and unresolved. Production dipped again, 27%. The factory floor felt tense now, like something was about to snap, but hadn't decided where yet. Workers moved faster, spoke less. Every delay echoed louder than it should. Every pause felt like a warning. And still, no one said her name out loud, because doing so would force a realization none of them were ready to face. They hadn't just overlooked her. They had built an entire operation around her, without ever admitting it. As night fell, the systems continued their quiet rebellion. Not a shutdown, not a failure. Something more precise, a withdrawal of cooperation. And somewhere beyond the factory walls, she remained exactly where she chose to be. Not reacting, not watching, not waiting. Because she already knew something they were only beginning to understand. Some systems don't break when you remove a part. They reveal the truth of how they were held together. And by the time that truth becomes visible, it's usually too late to pretend it wasn't there all along. If this moment made you pause, even for a second, then you're already seeing what they missed. Stay with the story. Because what follows isn't just a breakdown of a factory floor. It's a precise unraveling of assumptions, authority, and everything they thought was under control. And when the numbers finally speak loud enough, someone will have to answer for the silence. By hour 36, the factory stopped pretending it was in control. The numbers no longer whispered, they accused. A 43% drop in output sat on the main dashboard like an unblinking eye. No one spoke when it updated. No one needed to. The room had shifted from analysis to quiet containment, the corporate equivalent of holding your breath and hoping the structure doesn't collapse while you're inside it. On the factory floor, the change was physical. The air felt heavier, not because of heat or machinery, but tension. Workers moved with a kind of cautious precision, as if the system might react unpredictably to anything too sudden. Conversations were clipped. Eye contact was brief. Even the machine sounded different now, less like coordinated motion, more like reluctant compliance. The trainee hadn't left his station. He stood at the central console, cycling through diagnostics that returned the same answer every time. All systems operational. The phrase had become almost offensive, because nothing about this was operational. "We need to escalate," one of the senior managers finally said, voice low but firm. "To who?" another replied, sharper than intended. "Everything's within parameters." That's the problem. A pause, because for the first time someone had said it out loud. The system wasn't failing by definition. It was failing in practice. And that distinction, clean on paper, catastrophic in reality, was exactly where her expertise had always lived, in the gap between what should work and what actually does. By hour 40, line 3 halted completely. No warning, no error spike, just stopped. The conveyor froze mid-motion, carrying half-assembled units like unfinished sentences. Robotic arms paused mid-air, as if waiting for a cue that never came. For a moment, the silence that followed was almost peaceful. Then it spread. Line 5 slowed to a crawl. Line 1 began cycling inconsistently. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was systemic. Panic didn't erupt. It condensed. Managers gathered near the main display, voices overlapping now, urgency cutting through professionalism. Calls were made, specialists looped in, recommendations fired back in rapid succession, reset sequences, override protocols, emergency recalibrations. All executed, none effective. The trainee stepped back from the console for the first time, his confidence no longer cracking, but gone. In its place, recognition, late, quiet, unavoidable. "This doesn't make sense," he said, almost to himself. And for once, no one tried to correct him, because he was right. It didn't make sense. If you believed the system was self-sufficient, it made perfect sense, if you understood what had been removed. By hour 44, the first real conversation began. Not about data, about her. "She used to check line 3 manually every morning," someone said, hesitant, like recalling a detail that suddenly carried weight. "And she adjusted the cycle timing on line 5. By feel," another added. "Was that documented?" Silence. Of course it wasn't, because what she did didn't fit into documentation. It lived in intuition sharpened by repetition, in pattern recognition built over years, in a relationship with a system that couldn't be replicated by protocol. And they had called that replaceable. By hour 46, the COO was informed, not through summaries, not through filtered reports, directly. The kind of escalation reserved for situations that no longer obey hierarchy. He arrived without ceremony. No announcement, no entourage, just presence, and with it, a shift in gravity. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Screens were rechecked, postures adjusted. The room reorganized itself around a single question no one had yet answered. "How bad is it?" The COO didn't ask immediately. He observed the screens, the floor, the rhythm, or lack of it. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately, as if mapping something invisible beneath the visible failure. Then he spoke. "Show me the numbers." They did. Production down 71%, a figure so stark it stripped away interpretation. No context could soften it. No explanation could reframe it. Just a fact. He nodded once, then calmly. When did this start? A pause. Because the answer wasn't technical, it was chronological and uncomfortably human. 48 hours ago, someone said. Another silence. He didn't need more, didn't ask for logs, didn't request diagnostics, because he had already seen something more important, the pattern behind the pattern. He turned slightly, scanning the floor again. Not the machines this time, the absence between them. Who was responsible for maintaining real-time stability? He asked. Not the system, not the process. A person. The question landed differently. Eyes shifted, subtly, almost involuntarily, toward the empty space near line 3, where a pair of gloves still rested on the edge of the console, untouched, waiting. And for the first time since the decline began, the factory understood something with complete clarity. This wasn't a mechanical failure, it was a consequence. And consequences don't respond to resets. They respond to recognition. The COO's gaze lingered on the gloves for a fraction longer than necessary. Then he exhaled, quiet but decisive. Find her. Not urgent, not loud, but absolute, because the system hadn't broken. It had simply stopped cooperating with the illusion that it could function without the one person who truly understood it. And now, for the first time, they were ready to admit it. They found her faster than expected. Not because she was hiding, she wasn't. Because for the first time, they were actually looking in the right direction. Not through internal systems, not through access logs or HR records. Those had already been checked, rechecked, exhausted. The data said she was off shift. The system reduced her to a status update. But she had never existed in that system the way they thought. It was one of the older technicians who pointed it out. She doesn't go far, he said quietly, standing near the edge of the now stuttering line 3. When something's off, she listens first. Listens to what? A manager asked, impatient. He didn't answer immediately, just tilted his head slightly, as if hearing something the others couldn't. Everything. That was enough for the COO. Minutes later, they were outside. Behind the factory, past the loading bays and the steady choreography of trucks that no longer moved with confidence, there was a narrow service path. Not marked, not maintained, the kind of place that didn't appear on official layouts because it wasn't meant for process. It was meant for access. She was there, sitting on a low concrete barrier, gloves beside her, hands bare, resting loosely in her lap. Not tense, not waiting, just present, as if the silence around her was something she had chosen, not been forced into. She didn't look up when they approached, didn't need to. Footsteps carry intention, and these were heavy with it. The COO stopped a few steps away, not too close, not distant, measured. For a moment, no one spoke, because the dynamic had shifted. Inside, authority had been clear. Titles, roles, decisions flowing in one direction. Out here, it was different. Out here, they needed something they no longer controlled. You left the floor, the COO said finally. Not an accusation, a statement. She nodded once, a small movement, precise. The system is underperforming. Another nod, not surprised, not concerned, just acknowledging reality catching up. A pause stretched between them, not empty, charged, like a circuit waiting to close. We need you back, he said, direct, efficient, as if the problem could be solved with a simple reversal. This time she looked up, and for the first time since this began, someone in authority was actually seen. Her gaze was steady, not confrontational, not deferential, just clear. No, she said, The word landed without force, but with weight. Behind the COO, a manager shifted, as if to intervene. He didn't. Something in her tone made interruption feel inappropriate. "This isn't about need," she continued, her voice calm, almost quiet. "You've needed me the entire time." No emotion in the statement, just accuracy. The COO didn't respond immediately, because she was right, and they both knew it. Inside the factory, alarms didn't sound. No dramatic failure announced itself. But the absence of progress had become louder than any alert. Every minute was now a cost, measured in more than output. Reputation, contracts, confidence. Time, for the first time, was working against them. "What would bring you back?" he asked. There it was, not a command, a negotiation. She glanced past him toward the factory. Not at the building itself, but through it, as if she could still hear the misalignment, the disrupted rhythm, the quiet strain of systems trying to operate without understanding. "They promoted a trainee," she said. A simple observation, but it carried layers. The COO followed her gaze, then returned it to her. "Yes, they called it innovation." Another pause, because now they were no longer discussing production. They were discussing perception. "And they called you," he began, then stopped. He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. The words had already done their damage. She reached for her gloves, turning them slowly in her hands, not putting them on, just holding them, as if deciding whether they still belonged to her. "I don't need a title," she said. "I never did." A small shift in the air, subtle but real. "What I need is for the system to stop pretending it understands itself." The COO's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Calculation, recognition, adjustment. "You want authority?" he said. She shook her head. "No. Authority is what you give when you still think you're in control." Another silence. Longer this time, more honest. Inside the factory, Lean 3 attempted another restart. Failed. The sound didn't reach them clearly, but its absence did. "What I want," she continued, "is alignment between what's said and what's real." The COO exhaled slowly, because that was harder to grant than any title. It required more than a decision. It required an admission. Behind him, the managers were no longer restless. They were still. Watching, listening, for the first time not trying to solve the problem, trying to understand it. "And if we give you that?" he asked. She met his gaze again, not challenging, not testing, just waiting to see if the question meant anything. "Then I'll come back," she said. No hesitation, no conditions layered in complexity, just a single precise exchange. Truth for function. The COO nodded once, a decision forming, not rushed, but inevitable, because the system inside wasn't waiting anymore. It was collapsing, quietly, efficiently, and completely. And the only person who could restore it was no longer interested in fixing symptoms, only causes. He turned slightly, addressing the managers behind him without breaking the moment. "Prepare a full operational review," he said. "All undocumented procedures, all manual interventions, everything we've been calling exceptions." A ripple of realization moved through them, because exceptions had just been redefined as the foundation. "And the trainee?" one of them asked carefully. The COO didn't look away from her. "He'll learn," he said. "Properly. Not dismissal, correction." Then back to her. "When you return," he added, "it won't be to maintain the system." A brief pause. "It will be to redefine it." For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, but close. She stood, slow, deliberate, final. The glove slipped back onto her hands, not as routine, but as choice. And in that simple motion, something unseen began to realign, not just in the factory, in the way they understood it, because this was never about machines. It was about the quiet difference between running a system and actually knowing how it lives. When she stepped back onto the factory floor, nothing announced her return. No applause, no formal acknowledgement, no corrective memo flashing across internal systems. And yet, everything noticed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the way systems recognize what belongs to them. The air shifted first, then the rhythm, subtle, hesitant, as if the machinery itself was recalibrating its expectations. She didn't head to the central console, didn't look at the dashboards, the alerts, the anxious faces waiting for instruction. Instead, she walked past all of it, straight to line 3. The gloves were already on, not symbolic now, functional. She placed her hand lightly against the side panel, not pressing, not adjusting, just feeling. A pause, a listening, 2 seconds, 3. Then, movement. A slight adjustment to a timing dial no one had touched since the installation phase. Not because it was perfect, but because it was assumed to be. The line responded instantly. Not fully, not completely, but enough. A shift from resistance to cooperation. Behind her, someone inhaled sharply. Another stepped closer. The trainee watched without blinking, as if witnessing something he hadn't been trained to understand. She moved on. Line 5 next. No commands entered, no system overrides. Just a recalibration made through interaction rather than instruction. A sequence shortened by less than half a second. Insignificant on paper, transformative in motion. The hesitation vanished, not eliminated, absorbed, like friction being acknowledged instead of ignored. Within minutes, the factory floor began to breathe again. Not perfectly, not efficiently, not yet, but intentionally. She didn't rush, didn't attempt to fix everything at once, because she knew something they were only beginning to learn. You don't restore a system by forcing it back into performance. You restore it by reintroducing understanding. Behind her, the COO stood silently, not observing the numbers this time, observing the process. The difference was subtle, but critical. By the time she reached line 1, the first real indicator appeared on the main dashboard. Output stabilizing. No spike, no dramatic recovery, just alignment. And alignment, in a system this complex, was more powerful than speed. "She's not using the console," one manager whispered. The COO didn't respond, because the answer was already clear. She wasn't operating through the system. She was operating with it. By hour 2 of her return, the noise had changed again. The factory no longer sounded strained. It sounded coherent, like a conversation that had found its rhythm after interruption. Production climbed, 52%, then 61%. No artificial boosts, no emergency overrides, just restoration, the kind that holds. The trainee approached cautiously, stopping a few steps behind her as she worked. "Can you show me what you're doing?" he asked. His voice carried something new, not confidence, not authority, respect. She didn't turn immediately. Finish the adjustment in her hands first. Always finish the action, then respond. "It's not something I can show you," she said. A pause, then softer. "But it's something you can learn." He nodded, not discouraged, engaged, because for the first time he understood the difference between knowledge and instruction, between being told and actually seeing. The COO stepped forward then, closing the distance that had existed since the beginning. "The review is in motion," he said. "Everything undocumented. We're mapping it." She nodded once, eyes still on the line. "Good," she replied. "Start with what you've been ignoring." A quiet statement, but it carried direction sharper than any formal directive. By the end of the shift, production reached 84%. Not perfect, but real, sustainable, and more importantly, understood. The dashboards no longer told the full story. They couldn't, because what had been restored wasn't just output, it was awareness. The VP returned late that evening. Different energy this time. Less certainty, more observation. He stood near the central console, watching as the system he thought he understood moved in ways he couldn't fully predict. "Impressive recovery," he said, attempting neutrality. No one responded immediately, because the word recovery didn't quite fit. This wasn't a bounce back. It was a correction, a realignment between perception and reality. She passed by him without stopping. Not dismissive, not confrontational, just uninterested in revisiting a moment that had already revealed everything it needed to. But as she moved past, she paused. Briefly. Just enough. "You were right about one thing," she said, not turning. The VP straightened slightly. "We do need thinkers." A beat, then, "But thinking starts with seeing what's actually there." And then she kept walking. No emphasis, no lingering, just truth, delivered with precision. The VP didn't reply, because for the first time, he didn't have a framework to respond from. Behind him, the system continued to run, not flawlessly, but honestly. And that difference was exactly what would keep it running. As the lights dimmed and the final shift took over, the factory settled into something new. Not just operation, understanding. And somewhere between the hum of machines and the quiet recalibration of people, one thing became unmistakably clear. She had never just been a mechanic. She had been the system's memory, its instinct, its missing language. And now that language was no longer invisible. It was recognized, integrated, respected. The line didn't just start again, it learned how to listen. And it's